I invited my parents to lunch to reveal some big news. My mom scoffed, "This better not be another one of your ridiculous schemes." My dad added, "We don't have time for your little projects." So I tucked the house deed back into my coat and declared, "Forget it. I was going to buy you a $1.1 million home. Now they're begging to meet again." I, 32M, stared at the house deed in my hands, the weight of it heavier than the paper it was printed on. After 15 years of being dismissed, belittled, and treated like the family disappointment, I was about to surprise my parents with the biggest gift of their lives. Or so I thought. The restaurant was one of those upscale places downtown where the waiters wore pressed shirts and the menu didn't have prices. I'd chosen it specifically because Mom always complained about never going anywhere nice. I arrived early, the deed folded carefully in my inner coat pocket, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. My parents walked in exactly on time, which somehow felt like an accusation. Dad wore his usual stern expression, the one that had greeted every report card, every job announcement, every attempt I'd made to share good news over the years. Mom followed behind him, already scanning the restaurant with that critical eye she reserved for places that might not meet her standards. They sat down across from me, and I could feel the familiar weight of their judgment settling over the table like a heavy blanket. Dad checked his watch immediately, a gesture so automatic I wondered if he even realized he was doing it. Mom picked up the menu and frowned at it, muttering something about the prices being ridiculous. I tried to start with small talk, asking about their week, their health, anything to ease into the moment I'd been planning for months. But they seemed distracted, impatient. Dad kept glancing at his phone, and Mom made several comments about how busy they were, how they'd had to rearrange their entire afternoon just to meet me. The waiter came by, and we ordered. I could barely focus on the menu, my mind racing with anticipation. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything between us. After years of being the son who never quite measured up, I was about to prove them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. I waited until after the appetizers arrived, trying to build up the courage to speak. My hand kept drifting to my coat pocket, feeling the crisp edges of the deed through the fabric. Finally, I cleared my throat and told them I had some big news to share. Mom's reaction was immediate and crushing. She rolled her eyes and made a comment about this better not being another one of my ridiculous schemes. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I tried to push through, explaining that this was different, that this was something special. Dad jumped in then, his voice carrying that familiar tone of barely contained irritation. He said they didn't have time for my little projects, that they'd already wasted enough of their afternoon coming here. He gestured around the restaurant, as if the very act of being there was some enormous sacrifice they were making for their disappointing son. I felt something inside me snap. Not break, exactly, but snap back into place like a rubber band that had been stretched too far. All those years of trying to win their approval, of swallowing their criticism, of accepting their dismissal of everything I did or tried to do, suddenly crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. My hand moved to my coat pocket, and I pulled out the deed. For just a second, I held it above the table, watching their eyes focus on the official-looking document. Then I folded it carefully and tucked it back into my coat. I told them to forget it. I explained that I had been planning to buy them a house, a beautiful $1.1 million home in the neighborhood they'd always dreamed of living in. I mentioned how I'd spent weeks working with a realtor, how I'd already secured the financing, how I'd imagined their faces when they realized their son had finally made something of himself. The change in their expressions was immediate and almost comical. Dad's mouth actually fell open, and Mom's fork clattered against her plate. They both started talking at once, asking questions, demanding details, suddenly very interested in what I had to say. But I was done. I stood up, threw enough cash on the table to cover the meal, and walked out. Behind me, I could hear them calling my name, but I didn't turn around. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly free. The call started that evening. First Mom, then Dad, then both of them together on speakerphone. They wanted to know if I was serious, if the offer was real, if we could meet again to discuss it properly. I let every call go to voicemail. The next day brought more calls, and the day after that. They showed up at my apartment building, but I'd already left for work. They called my office, but I'd instructed my assistant to tell them I was unavailable. They even reached out to my few remaining friends, trying to get someone to intercede on their behalf. Update 1. A week passed before I finally answered one of their calls. Mom was crying, which was something I'd seen maybe 3 times in my entire life. She apologized for what she'd said at the restaurant, claimed she'd been having a bad day, insisted that she'd always believed in me. Dad got on the line and echoed her sentiments, his voice unusually subdued. They wanted to meet again, to hear about this house, to understand how their son had managed to accumulate enough wealth to make such an offer. I agreed, but on my terms. We would meet at my office, during business hours, and they would listen to what I had to say without interruption. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I spent the intervening days thinking about what I wanted to say, how I wanted to handle this moment. Part of me was tempted to go through with the original plan, to buy them the house and finally earn the approval I'd been seeking my entire life. But a larger part of me recognized that this was about more than money or real estate. They arrived at my office building looking nervous and out of place. My assistant showed them to the conference room, where I'd laid out the house listing, the financial documents, and the deed. When they walked in and saw everything spread across the table, their eyes went wide. I explained how I'd built my consulting business from nothing, how the contracts I'd been landing over the past 2 years had finally paid off in a big way. I showed them the bank statements, the investment portfolios, the proof that their disappointment of a son had somehow managed to become financially successful. Dad picked up the house listing with shaking hands. It was a beautiful property in the exact neighborhood where they'd always talked about retiring. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a garden that Mom would love, a garage where Dad could finally have his workshop. Everything they'd ever mentioned wanting, all wrapped up in a package they could never have afforded on their own. Mom asked if this was real, if I was really prepared to buy this for them. I told her it was real, that I'd already been pre-approved for the mortgage, that I could have the papers signed within a week. But then I explained the conditions. I wanted a genuine apology, not just for what had happened at the restaurant, but for years of dismissing my efforts and treating me like I was destined to fail. I wanted acknowledgement that they had been wrong about me, that their constant criticism had been unfair and damaging. Most importantly, I wanted them to understand that this gift came with no strings attached, that I wasn't buying their love or approval, but simply choosing to be generous despite how they'd treated me. They both broke down then, really broke down. Dad, who I'd never seen cry, had tears streaming down his face as he talked about how proud he was, how sorry he was for not seeing my potential. Mom grabbed my hands and apologized over and over, saying she'd been scared that I would get hurt by dreaming too big, that her criticism had come from a place of misguided protection. Update 2. I bought them the house. Not because their apologies had magically erased years of hurt, but because I realized that holding on to resentment was only hurting me. The closing took place 3 weeks later, and I handed them the keys in the driveway of their new home. The change in our relationship was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, I was the son who could do no wrong. Every phone call began with them asking about my business, my success, my plans for the future. They bragged about me to their friends, showed off pictures of the house, and made sure everyone knew that their son had bought it for them. But something felt hollow about it all. Their newfound respect and admiration was based entirely on my financial success, not on who I was as a person. They loved the version of me that could afford to buy them $1 million house, but I wasn't sure they actually knew or cared about the real me underneath all that. 6 months after they moved in, I was having dinner with them in their new dining room when Mom made a comment about how I should buy a bigger house for myself, something that would properly reflect my success. Dad agreed, suggesting that I look into some of the more exclusive neighborhoods, places where successful people lived. I realized then that nothing had really changed. They still saw me primarily through the lens of what I could provide or achieve, not as their son who deserved love and respect regardless of his bank account. The house had bought me their attention and admiration, but it hadn't bought me the genuine relationship I'd been seeking my entire life. The final revelation came during a family gathering at their new house. My aunt made a comment about how lucky they were to have such a successful son, and Mom's response was telling. She said that she'd always known I had it in me, that she'd always believed I would make something of myself. It was a complete rewriting of history, and she seemed to genuinely believe it. I excused myself from the party and walked out to the garden. The one Mom had fallen in love with the moment she saw the house listing. Standing there among the flowers I'd essentially paid for, I finally understood that my revenge had been both complete and completely hollow. Update 3. The real revenge wasn't in the moment at the restaurant when I'd tucked the deed back into my coat. It wasn't in making them beg for another meeting or in watching them grovel for forgiveness. The real revenge was in realizing that I didn't need their approval anymore, that I'd built a successful life despite their lack of support, not because of any motivation they provided. I continued to visit them regularly, continued to maintain a relationship with them, but something fundamental had shifted. I no longer sought their validation or approval. When they praised my business success, I thanked them politely but didn't feel the surge of satisfaction I once would have. When they criticized something I was doing, I listened without the defensive anger that used to consume me. The house became a symbol of something different than what I'd originally intended. Instead of being a gesture of love or a way to finally earn their respect, it became a reminder that I was capable of generosity even toward people who had hurt me. It was proof that I could rise above their treatment of me and choose to be the bigger person. My business continued to grow, and with it came more opportunities to help others. I started a scholarship fund for kids from families like mine, families where dreams were dismissed and ambitions were treated as unrealistic fantasies. I began mentoring young entrepreneurs, offering them the encouragement and support I'd never received. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents' dismissal and criticism had ultimately made me stronger, more determined, more resilient. Their lack of faith in me had forced me to develop an unshakable faith in myself. Their refusal to support my dreams had taught me to be self-reliant and resourceful. A year after buying them the house, I was featured in a local business magazine. The article talked about my success story, my rise from struggling consultant to successful entrepreneur. When the reporter asked about my inspiration, I found myself talking about the importance of believing in yourself even when others don't, about the power of perseverance in the face of doubt. My parents framed the article and hung it in their living room, right next to a photo of the house. They showed it to every visitor, telling the story of their successful son with pride and enthusiasm. But I knew the truth that they seemed to have forgotten or chosen to ignore. Their son had succeeded not because of their support, but in spite of their lack of it. The final twist in this story came during a recent visit. Mom was showing me some updates they'd made to the house, improvements funded by the money they'd saved by not having a mortgage payment. She mentioned how grateful they were, how this house had changed their lives, how proud they were to be my parents. Then she said something that stopped me cold. She told me that she hoped I understood that everything they'd done, all their criticism and doubt over the years, had been their way of trying to make me stronger. She claimed that they'd always believed in me, but had pushed me harder because they knew I was capable of great things. I looked at her standing in the kitchen of the house I'd bought her, rewriting history with such conviction that I almost believed she believed it herself. And I realized that this was the ultimate revenge. Not the moment of their humiliation at the restaurant, not their desperate calls and apologies, but this moment of perfect clarity where I could see exactly who they were and choose to love them anyway. I smiled and told her I understood. Because I did understand, finally and completely. I understood that some people can only show love through criticism, can only express faith through doubt, can only demonstrate care through control. I understood that their limitations didn't have to become my limitations, that their inability to support me properly didn't diminish my achievements. The house stands as a monument to forgiveness, to the choice to be generous even when generosity isn't deserved. Every time I visit, I'm reminded that the best revenge isn't making someone pay for their mistakes, but rising above those mistakes and choosing to be better than the treatment you received. My parents still live in that house, still brag about their successful son, still rewrite history to make themselves the heroes of my story. And I let them, because I've learned that the truth doesn't need their acknowledgement to be real. My success doesn't need their validation to be meaningful. My worth doesn't depend on their approval to be genuine. The deed is still in my files, a reminder of the day I learned that the most powerful revenge is living well, succeeding despite the odds, and choosing grace over grudges. Sometimes the best way to win is to stop playing the game entirely.